The Nintendo Switch and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild are defying expectations and crushing sales records for Nintendo. The Nintendo Switch is the fastest selling Nintendo console ever. Yes, outselling the Wii. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is the fastest selling Nintendo launch title ever. Yes, defeating Super Mario 64. So it's pretty insane to see how excited people were for this system, how excited people were for this game, because a lot of critics said that the system wasn't going to do that well. I think really me and Wood from Beat 'em Ups were the only two YouTubers that were really genuinely excited for this system and saw the potential for it to do great things. And it's nice to see this sort of success translating to Nintendo already, because as I said in my hardware review, I am a big fan of this system. Now, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is also currently one of the highest rated games ever. I'm talking 10s out of 10s, 5s out of 5s, A pluses, and people are going nuts for this game. People are saying it's one of the greatest games of all time. It is nearly a perfect game. And of course, there's going to be people who are like, it's a Zelda game, who cares about that? But then there are people with legitimate complaints. There are people that are saying, hey, this isn't a 10 out of 10 game. There are issues within this game. Now, I've been playing the game for over 50 hours, and I have not defeated The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild yet, but that's sort of my choice. I'm taking my time with this game. I want to explore every nook and cranny, really get down to the gameplay mechanics, really get down to what the developers were thinking when they created this game. And I feel that in my 50 plus hours, I've been able to sort of figure out things about this game that maybe other people didn't really realize and maybe people overlooked. So, with that in mind, I want to look at the positives and the negatives of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild to figure out one thing. Is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild overrated? Let's find out. So the way this video is going to work is we're going to first look at the negative aspects of the game and then end on the positive aspects of the game, and then at the end we will figure out if this game is indeed overrated, because I like to focus on the negative before focusing on the positive. So let's dive right into the negative things. The biggest complaint, of course, is frame rate issues. Now, this game runs at 900p 30 frames per second when it's docked, 720p 30 frames per second when it's undocked on the Nintendo Switch. I can't speak for the Wii U version as I have not played that and I do not own this. We're just strictly talking about the Switch version. Now, there are frame rate issues in the game. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. When you're on that great plateau at the start of the game, and I'm going to keep this video pretty minimal on spoilers, so bear with me in mind. So when you're on that great plateau, you definitely do see some frame rate issues. And it's kind of strange because that's sort of where you spend the first little bit of the game. But once you get off of that great plateau, the frame rate issues just seem to sort of dissipate. You know, they're still there, but they're not nearly as frequent as they are in that little intro area, which is very strange to me because it doesn't seem like that area is really, you know, heavily has a lot of things going on in it. So I don't really understand why that little section seems to have a majority of the frame rate issues. Now, when you're out adventuring in the world, yes, there are hiccups here and there, but they don't seem as prevalent. They don't seem to happen as frequently. I've gone many play sessions without experiencing any frame rate issues, but then sometimes they do creep up. And one of the things that seems to trigger that is when an enemy has a fire-based weapon and they light the grass on fire and there are multiple enemies. I have experienced some slowdown in those areas. And yeah, for sure, that is a legitimate complaint. That is a legitimate gripe. The frame rate issues are prevalent. Frame rate issues, what happens with those is it sort of sucks you out of the game. It sort of jars your memory. You know, you're lost in this huge world and then all of a sudden, you know, the game hiccups a little bit and you're like, oh wait, you know, this is reality. This is just a video game. So I definitely understand that complaint and I think it's a valid complaint because there are frame rate issues in the game. Another thing that people talk about is just the world itself. A lot of people seem to think that the world is a bit too barren, and when you compare it to a game like Grand Theft Auto or like Elder Scrolls, you know, one of the Elder Scrolls title, I could definitely see that point. It's definitely not a world that's molded after that. Do I necessarily think that's a bad thing? I personally don't, and we'll talk about that more in the positive section, but that definitely is a legitimate complaint for some gamers. Another thing that gamers are talking about that's sort of a complaint is the difficulty. This Zelda game is difficult, more difficult than any Zelda game, period. I have died more in this game than I have in every Zelda game combined times 10. By far. Like, I have died so much in this game, and the difficulty can be a bit jarring because Zelda's always sort of been that action adventure game that anyone can play and anyone could really get into no matter what your age is. And this definitely has a higher difficulty spike. And I can see that being a bit off-putting for younger players as well. The final main complaint that I've seen is the lack of a traditional dungeon system. Now, when you're playing The Legend of Zelda, you know one thing. There's going to be dungeons, and you go into the dungeon, you go into your first dungeon, which is clearly laid out to you, and they say, hey, you need to beat this dungeon. And when you beat that dungeon, what happens? You get an item, and then that item allows you to go to the next dungeon, so on and so forth. And that's how you get your main items in the game. This game is devoid of any traditional dungeons, and that, once again, can be very off-putting, especially for Zelda veterans. It's definitely a bit of a culture shock. It's definitely different, and, you know, the only thing that really resembles any sort of dungeons are the 4 divine beasts that you come across in the game, and of course, the hundreds of shrines that are in the game, but still, it's definitely nowhere near a traditional Zelda dungeon. So far, we have 4 complaints that are pretty legitimate, in my opinion. You have the frame rate issues, you have the open world sort of being a bit barren, you have the lack of a traditional dungeons, and the difficulty. So 4 very valid issues. Now that we've got all the negative out of the way, let's talk about the positive of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So before we get into the additional positive points, let's look at the negative points and see if we could talk about them in any sort of positive way. Now, the frame rate issues, like I said, there's nothing you can really do about that. There's nothing really you can say about that. Do I think it's a bit blown out of proportion by some gamers? I do. I don't think it's nearly as bad as people are making it out to be, but however, it is an issue. It is an issue that exists. The difficulty, I don't care about that. I think the difficulty is phenomenal because it makes you think. It makes you think about situations in a different way, in a different light. The world being a bit barren, I think that's, you know, indicative of the game. This isn't supposed to be, you know, a hustling, bustling city. This is a huge, massive world, and not every little intricacy is going to be filled with life. I mean, if you live in a wooded area, if you live in a, you know, a rural area, you kind of know how life can be. You know, you could go, you know, 5-10 miles without seeing a home. So I sort of get what they were going for with that. I like the fact that the world, you know, sometimes it seems like sometimes you'll be walking around and you'll be like, wow, there's really nothing here. And then all of a sudden you'll stumble upon something and it makes it all worthwhile. Or you'll see something in the distance and that's where you'll want to go to. So that makes it really interesting to me. And the lack of a traditional dungeon system, I think that's just how the game was designed. It wasn't designed with a traditional Zelda sort of gameplay style in mind. They sort of designed it to be different. And so while I could see people having an issue with that, me personally, it's a non-issue for me because I like this. This is a breath of fresh air. It does get tiring knowing how a Zelda game is going to work out. I believe I've defeated A Link Between Worlds in like 10 to 12 hours because you know how the game is. You know what's going to happen. You know what you have to do. You got to go from dungeon to dungeon, get item and item so you can progress through the game. Whereas this game, it's very different. So let's talk about the positive aspects aside from, you know, clarifying the negative aspects. And probably the biggest positive in this game is the fact that for the first time, you are Link. And what do I mean by that? I mean, this game doesn't hold your hand at all. There is no tutorial. There is no sort of, hey, this is how you play the game. They just throw you into this massive world and you literally can go anywhere from the start of the game. Sure, you might die along the way and you will die along the way, but you can literally just look out in this world and be like, hey, I want to go over there. And it'll take you a long ass time. I have walked for hours and hours and hours. And yes, I could have gone on a horse, but I like to just walk sometimes. And it's just fun to stumble across all these things. It's really interesting. And you being Link, you know, you're having to craft, you know, your meals and stuff to revive your health. You're having to come up with recipes. There's no recipe book. You literally have to find things in the world that sort of give you hints on what to do. And it's just like, wow, I really am Link. Here's something really interesting. So I was watching Wood's video about The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild system sales, and I watched him do the sort of slide on his shield thing down a hill. And I messaged him, I was like, that's a thing? I can do that now? He was like, yeah, you've never done that? And I was like, no, the game never told you to. He was like, oh, I was just messing around with the buttons and I figured out how to do this. And I was just like, Oh, I've played this game for over 50 hours, and I did not realize that I could simply slide on my shield down a hill or something to save speed. And it's little things like that. Little things like every single character, for the first time in a Zelda game, has a purpose. Every single character that you talk to, from major characters to minor characters, serves a purpose, because what they do is, whether you realize it or not, they're giving you hints on, where shrines are, on what you need to do next, on where items are. There's so many little intricacies in this world. It's really just mind-blowing. Another awesome thing is the enemy AI. This is really advanced enemy AI, and you have to remember, this isn't necessarily a Switch, exclusive. This was developed for the Wii U in mind, and the fact that they got such advanced AI is just amazing to me. They read and react to situations in such a way that I've never really seen anything like it before, and it's really amazing. It's really breathtaking how many different times or how many different ways there are to handle enemies and handle situations. And I think the biggest positive for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is just that I don't think any two players that are playing the game have the exact same experience because of this open world mentality. Even if you play a game like Elder Scrolls or Grand Theft Auto, you can have very similar experiences, especially if you're doing like the story mode and you're just following the main story mode, you're not doing side missions or anything. You will have a very similar experience than to the next person. Whereas this game, everyone I've talked to has a completely different experience. Everyone has different weapons. Everyone has different armor. Everyone went a different place first. And everyone's discovered something that someone else hasn't discovered. Unless you're using an FAQ, a walkthrough, a strategy guide or something, you are really experiencing this game on your own. You are Link. You are trying to save the Kingdom of Hyrule and Princess Zelda. And it's just, I've never played a game like it. And I've been playing games for, nearly 27, 28 years. And I can honestly say I've never played a game quite like this, an open world game where you're having to think constantly. I almost make a sort of analogy that it's like The Legend of Zelda on a modern engine meets Metal Gear Solid 3, because there's that survival aspect. Surviving is very difficult in this game. Hunting animals like in Metal Gear Solid 3. Riding animals. I rode an ox, or not an ox, a goat once. Like, I just saw a goat and I was like, oh, I want to ride it. And I ended up riding the goat. Like, there's just so many possibilities. There's so many side quests. There's so many shrines. There's so much stuff to discover in the land of Hyrule. And the fact that the game doesn't guide you, the game just tells you to play how you want to play. That's what makes this game special. So now, we have looked at the negatives. We have looked at the positives. But the question still remains, is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild overrated? I'll keep the answer short and sweet. I don't think it is. Because a 10 out of 10 doesn't necessarily mean that a game is perfect. No game is perfect. You can find a glitch in any game from the dawn of time. Every single game has glitches. Every single game has programming issues. Every single game has a flaw. I can find a flaw in any game. Name a game in the comments, I'll find a flaw in it. And that's not really what gaming is all about to me. It's more about your experience. No game is ever going to be a perfect experience. There's always going to be something in the game that you could point out and say, hey, this is a flaw. But as a Zelda game, as an open world game, as a launch game for the Nintendo Switch, I think it's the perfect game for this. It's the perfect game in the Legend of Zelda franchise. It's the perfect game for the Nintendo Switch launch. It's the perfect game of 2017, the early part of the year, because it's just very different. It's very different. It defies your expectations and it just branches out. Is it a perfect game? No, it's not. It's definitely not a perfect game. There are issues. There are frame rate issues. But what is perfect in life? Who is perfect in life? There's nothing perfect in life. Everything has flaws. And it's not necessarily about, examining the flaws and saying, oh, well, this makes this thing not perfect. Because if that was the case, nothing in life is perfect. No car, no home, no person, no individual. So to me, this is art. This is just, transcends traditional video games. It's an amazing game, and I don't think it's overrated. I think it deserves all the praise in the world, and I think it deserves all the sales in the world. So I may be wrong though. Let me know in the comments section if you think The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is indeed overrated. And thank you for watching this video. I had a fun time doing it. If you liked this video, be sure to like it and leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this on the channel. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe, check out other videos on the channel. And if you really like my face, check out my Patreon. I'll catch you guys next time. Later.